Dear Tennessee, well, they say what starts in California ends up everywhere in the country, so I am sending a warning from California. And the warning is around this idea of critical race theory. And you're probably hearing a ton of it on the news, and if you suspect it's in your schools, it probably is, and it sounds like it already is, and that's kind of a disappointment to me and my wife because we're moving to Williamson County, Tennessee to get away from this divisive ideology. I think the first point that I would want to make about CRT and just how we've experienced out here is that it never announces itself as critical race theory. It's going to come in the form of other ideas like white privilege or unconscious bias training or white fragility. But its most typical disguise is DEI, what is known as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And another word that you'll hear a lot is anti-racism or anti-racism training. And these ideas, they sound and they look great. Like, who doesn't want to be about diversity, inclusion, and equity? I want to be fair. I love diversity. I want to be welcoming and include people. So the problem with all of that is that none of these terms mean what they sound like. And it's something you figure out very quickly when these programs start to be installed. The second thing is that the way that DEI or anti-racism training will often come in is through a consultancy or maybe some kind of committee. But either way, there's going to be a purely leftist Marxist sort of political filter put on these ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these ideas won't be up for debate. They'll call them something like uncomfortable conversations or bold conversations, but really these are not conversations, these are one-way monologues. You can ask a question in these training sessions or when you're hearing this curriculum, but it'll only be tolerated so long as you're on the way to accepting and agreeing with their view on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And ironically, there is no diversity of thought allowed. Diversity for them means everybody looks different, but you have to think exactly the same. So viewpoint diversity is not what they're talking about. Usually what predicates or triggers the DEI consultancy or a committee that's going to form is an accusation of racism against the institution of some kind, the school or whatever it is. And it's often going to start with a nebulous charge of systemic racism and something very hard to kind of prove or disprove. And because CRT makes the assumption that racism explains all inequity, the accusation could just simply be that the school is not diverse enough, and that will be proof of systemic racism in the school. Or it could be some interaction between a student and a student, or a student and a teacher, or a student and an administrator that will be deemed racially insensitive or racist. Maybe it's just a post on social media, on Instagram or something that offended somebody or was deemed racist. Or it'll just be found that your institution is not sufficiently anti-racist, which we can talk about in a bit. But either way, it's proof of systemic racism in the school or in the institution, and at that point, here comes the DEI consultancy or the DEI committee. After a DEI consultancy is hired, what will happen from there is this. Administrators and teachers are going to acquiesce to this charge of the school needing to commit to doing the work of undoing systemic racism. This is going to lead to all kinds of training sessions and conversations. And why you're probably wondering, why would the administration and the teachers kind of concede to this? And a big reason is that teachers and administrators don't want to be accused of being racist. That's a big reason. Another one is that they don't want to be accused of not being anti-racist enough. Another reason is that teachers and administrators will concede is that they have a desire to appear compassionate or noble on the right side of history. So they embrace CRT-inspired DEI essentially to look good. Then you'll have your activists, right? You'll have administrators and teachers who are true believers and they want to advance their ideology. And they think, if you think about the fact that most teachers are coming from college campuses and this is what they're immersed in, so they're activists and they're true believers. Some might think that DEI sounds nice, so what could really be the harm? That sounds like nice stuff and I'm for all that. But again, there's going to be a purely kind of leftist, Marxist political filter put on these DEI ideas, and that's how DEI will be presented to your institution or school. And the definitions won't be up for debate. After the DEI consultancy is brought in or a committee is formed, it will inevitably assert that the institution is racially biased. And so CRT makes the assumption that all white people are racially biased. And that's true whether you're conscious of it or they'll say you're unconscious of your bias. So they're going to find it one way or the other. And if you debate that assertion as a student, as a teacher, or even a parent, they're going to say you haven't done the work, or you need more diversity, equity, and inclusion training, i.e. more indoctrination is essentially what they're saying you need. Or it's going to be that your white fragility is showing, and that's sort of this notion from Robin DiAngelo that it's your inability to accept the fact that you're basically a racist. That's white fragility. So if you try to stay silent, that might seem like an option to you. I'm just going to be quiet. I don't really understand what's going on here. I don't totally agree. But if you try to stay silent, you may also be told silence is violence or silence is complicity, and an attempt to force you out by getting you to talk and either agree, that's what they want you to do, but if you happen to disagree, then they're going to put a target on you. In other words, it's basically this. They're going to call you a witch, and if you say you're not a witch, then it's proof that you're a witch, and if you say you are a witch, you are a witch, and either way they win, you're a racist. And if that doesn't work, you're going to be socially stigmatized. That's what happens to people who stand up to this, teachers or administrators or even parents, or even kids in class. And as we've seen across the country, you could be canceled, right? This happens a lot. And they'll do this by problematizing something that you've said or done. Maybe it was done in the past. They'll dig it up, or they'll just call you a bigot, or there's many ways to kind of shame people with this. It's kind of a powerful tool. And you might be saying, like, who is the they? And I guess the they is just the people who drink the Kool-Aid. They could be teachers, students, or other parents. I mean, I think one of the things to understand about critical race theory and the diversity, equity, inclusion kind of training that comes out of it, it is a cult. It is like a replacement religion, and it's complete with zealots and heretics and sins, and it's got a very religious vibe to it, and is very cult-like. It's like, and if you've ever been around somebody who's been in a cult, when you try to talk to them, it's like glassy eyes, like it's hard to penetrate that. So what's the result for your kids once this seeps into your school? And what did we see here? Well, the DEI committee or the consultancy is going to help adopt a curriculum that's going to instruct the students of the school to see everything through a racialized lens, right? And that's what CRT does. And I mean everything: the environment, healthcare, the justice system, math, civics, history, science. Everything will be discussed through a racialized lens eventually. CRT, and it's just an interesting thing to understand about it, it's a takeover ideology. That means it's an all-encompassing sort of filter through which to view the world, and once it's in, it takes over whatever institution. So if it's a school, it's going to take it over, kind of like a virus. And here's some of the concepts that your kids are going to be taught. Your kids are going to be taught the opposite of MLK's dream of colorblindness, right? And being judged by your character, the content of your character. And instead, they're going to be taught to be color conscious, like to be really aware of color and race. Your kids are going to be taught the idea of systemic racism, which is the idea that every law, policy, and institution in America is racist to the core, literally invented to oppress and to hold power over BIPOC people, which is Black, Indigenous people of color. They're going to be taught, your kids also, this concept of anti-racism. And being anti-racist for white people means this. It's basically admitting that you are a racist oppressor, right? It's the Marxist view of viewing everything in society through oppressor and the oppressed. So you are a racist oppressor if you're white. And that America is systemically racist again. It's systemically racist through and through. And then demanding anti-racism demands that your kid fight systemic racism and oppression by becoming an activist. And they'd like you as a parent to do that as well. And some schools have actually asked parents to sign pledges that they will teach it at home and become anti-racist. They're going to teach your kids also things like objectivity, merit, hard work, and the scientific method are white ideas. Those are white ways of learning. And they're constructs of a white supremacist country. Again, they're invented, these ideas of objectivity and scientific methods and the ways of, these white ways of knowing, they were invented to oppress people of color. Another thing they're going to teach your kids is that subjectivity is paramount. So concepts like my truth and your truth are going to replace the truth. You're going to hear a ton about lived experiences. My lived experiences, what I experienced. You're going to hear about microaggressions, but it's all the idea that people's feelings, person's subjective feelings, personal experiences, and subjective feelings are what are important rather than objectivity, empirical data, and logic, because those are just products, empirical data, objectivity, and logic, of a culture of whiteness, they'll say, and a white way of thinking, and they're just tools of the oppressor. That's what those are. Your kids are going to also be taught a version of American history in such a way that your kid will conclude that America is a uniquely evil country. And so there's going to be new narratives like the debunked 1619 project that the New York Times published. And it's not about balance, because you'll hear that, well, I want my kid to know the good and the bad. It's not about the good and the bad of America. That's a lie. It's about teaching kids to be ashamed of this country so that they'll want to radically change it, right? That's the goal of critical race theory, is systematic dismantling of America and replacing it with a new system. They're also going to teach your kid to feel shame about their skin color. If they're white, and especially, but they're also going to teach people of color that they are victims, and that's the way they should view themselves. So there's shame for everybody. And if they're white especially, they're going to be told to accept collective guilt for things that they didn't do, like slavery. That's going to be a concept they'll learn. And what is the goal of all this? And again, it's to turn your kid into an activist in order to deconstruct and dismantle America. That's what they want to do. And that might sound over the top, but take a look at the rhetoric and the country, and you'll see this thinking kind of saturating our media, our news, and all of our institutions, and it's coming through our schools. They want your kids' brains. That's what they want. And I want to give an example of how this played out in our small town. So we're from Los Angeles. We live in a little small peaceful town, and this ideology began to filter into our schools subtly. And we started noticing it a little bit. And me and my wife, who are Christians, decided, you know what, I don't know, I see sort of what's happening here. Kind of want to get the kids into a Christian school. So it wasn't that bad, but we kind of wanted that environment. And so we pulled our kids out. After the George Floyd death, this CRT, DEI sort of inspired ideology began to be taught even more. And so we have multiple anecdotes. This is a small town, so everybody knows everybody. So we have multiple anecdotes like this, like cartoon videos, parents finding their kids being taught on Zoom, cartoon videos teaching their kids that white people today are responsible for slavery or should have some kind of collective guilt over slavery. We had a neighbor's daughter that came home and asked her mom, is being white bad? This is the kind of stuff that kids were coming back to their parents with. So ultimately, this new curriculum and teaching materials cause this rift in our community. So it doesn't just stay in the school, this division, divisive sort of factionalism. And this is what CRT does. It just does. It creates divisions and factions. And that's because it's built on the notion of criticizing and problematizing, right? It just criticizes the system and problematizes everything. It has no solutions, really, except for to make you feel bad. But it's great at criticizing, and that's its whole purpose. So what happened in our town is a group of parents actually were concerned about this new curriculum, and so they put out a newspaper ad. It had an American flag in it. It was kind of a patriotic-looking ad, and it just pointed out that they objected to politics coming into the classroom, which just seems fair enough, right? They just wanted an apolitical environment for their kids to learn in, kind of like it's always been, right? Like kind of how when we grew up, I never felt like I was being pushed to be a Democrat or a Republican or told to be a leftist it depended on your teacher, but they were just saying, can we have an apolitical environment? And that prompted another faction of parents to take out a newspaper ad in response, essentially accusing the parents who kind of did the patriotic ad of not caring about Black lives, that their message was, and their newspaper ad was full of hate and racism. And so this is how it works. Agree with every tenet of CRT and DEI, or you're going to be called out. So the pro-DEI parents, the people that were for this critical race theory stuff, signed their names to their ad, calling out the other parents who were asking just for the politics to be taken out of the classroom, and said that these pro-CRT parents ultimately said that the pro-American parents must have been ashamed of their ad. And the proof of that is that the pro-American parents or the pro-American values parents did not sign their ad. Well, the reason they didn't sign their ad is that they were going to be called a bigot, a racist. They were going to be ostracized, and that is how this works. It works by socially stigmatizing people. And it's essentially a way to bully people. And in our town, we ended up having protests even against our little police department, which was just kind of shocking. And I don't think that many people really agree with all this, but they stay silent for fear that they're going to be targeted. And so to kind of wrap this up, the CRT-inspired diversity, equity, and inclusion teaching capitalizes on people's passivity. People are just trying to survive, right? You're just trying to survive this pandemic. You try to pay your bills, and you're just not paying attention to what's happening in your kid's school. It plays on people's guilt or their desire to be seen as a good person, right? But even more powerfully, it uses shame to destroy anybody who objects. And it's ironic, it's so ironic that they say that they're inclusive. They are not inclusive, the people that push this stuff. It is not about inclusivity. It's about exclusion and shaming anybody who doesn't conform. It's about obedience, agree or be excluded. And it sounds so good. That's the other thing, is it promises racial healing, but it delivers racial and political division. I've used the term because I think it's right, that it's a pretty poison. It looks good, but it's poison. And it politicizes everything. Literally everything becomes political. And its goal ultimately for your kids is to turn them into activists rather than just letting them be kids, right? Just letting them be kids and grow up. And we watched all this play out. I watched all this play out in our community, and it drives wedges into relationships, even for me personally, divided parents. And of course, we want to move to get away from it. And I think the fruit of this ideology is on display in our country. You know, it'd be one thing if like CRT was coming into the schools and DEI and we were seeing racial healing and increased harmony, but we're seeing more and more division, and the proof is in the CRT pudding, right? You can see it everywhere in our country. So I guess the last thing I would just say is please do not be seduced by this ideology. That would be my message to the administrators, to the teachers. Don't be seduced by this. It's not going to make things better. And don't be shamed to embracing neo-racist ideas. That's what this is. This is a new form of racism. We rejected it once. We need to reject it again. And I can say without reservation that whether people, peddling it, know it or not, it is racist and it is poison. Also, I think you can't rest on this idea, and this is to the parents, I think a little bit, that CRT was banned and think it's not still there in the curriculum or it isn't still circulating around. You have to stay vigilant, I think, and pay attention. And I just again would say that a vast majority of Americans and probably parents in Williamson County don't want this, but we have to stop cowering as Americans. I really believe that. And finally, I would just say this too. Finally, if you won't stand up against it for yourself, and I kind of get that, like your job's on the line, you're worried about social stigma, I get it. But please summon the strength to stand against it for your children. And I really do think if we're passive now or afraid to stand on the truth, that every individual's got to be judged first and foremost on what's inside their character, not on their skin color. And not that we do that perfectly, right? We don't do that perfectly, and we always got to seek to do that better. But ultimately, it is the character inside that we have to aspire to, that color blindness, even though we don't do it perfectly. And if we don't do that, it's our children's future that I think is going to be destroyed. So, sincerely, California.